Dr. Mark Changizi here with your Science Moment. When does it matter that folks have good intentions? When does that matter? Now, I've argued a lot in recent videos that whether or not folks are well-intentioned just doesn't matter for socio-political level evil. It doesn't matter, and the reason that it doesn't matter and is no defense is because it's vacuously true. It's tautologically true. It's always true that sociopolitical movements come to evolve over time to have sophisticated ethical justifications for their behaviors and their principles and their actions. Over time, the entire community evolves. It emerges, often post hoc, to justify the stuff that they're doing. So those in the community believe they're justified. They believe they're well-intentioned, right, to do all the things that they're doing, often horrible things, when they're crushing the skulls of their enemies, both metaphorically and literally in some cases, when they're recommending banishment, firing, sending to camps, and so forth. They're doing it for a good cause. Of course, they're not well-intentioned to those particular folks, the unclean folks in the out-group, but they're doing it with good intent concerning the notion of good that has come to be in their community, right? So some people find this highly counterintuitive. And so what is evil, something that we've talked about, what is evil is not whether or not you have good intentions or bad intentions for sociopolitical level evil. It concerns whether you break certain kinds of principles, something that we've talked about before. But I think, you might say, this is a little counterintuitive, and I think there is counterintuitive aspects to understanding evil at the level of society, where there's socio-political movements involved, and it's not individuals necessarily defending and justifying to themselves, but whole communities, and in some sense a much bigger, much more complicated object. But there's a sense in which it occurred to me that I think this is really quite obvious in another context. And so in everyday context of everyday criminality and everyday behavior, well-intentionedness matters, right? It's something that we talk about all the time, whether it's the FBI or whether it's just regular old stuff in your life. What their intentions were is crucial to whether you consider them guilty of whatever it is that they were doing. And the reason that it matters in everyday life is because concerning those everyday things like stealing and scamming and raping and hitting and murdering, all of these sorts of things, in regards to those things, we are all part of the same sociopolitical movement. We all agree on those things being wrong. Right? There's a huge baseline of stuff over almost all of us in these separate sociopolitical movements that in these regards, we're all the same. We're all part of the same sociopolitical movement that we think rape, murder, stealing, hitting people over the head for no reason is wrong. For those within your movement, your sociopolitical movement, in this case, it's sort of a broader one than what we're usually used to talking about because we all share it. We don't think of it as a movement at all. For those sorts of things, we all agree, right? And so really the question in everyday life is not, it just comes down to, did they do what they did, which may have ended up with someone getting hit on the head, but did they do it with a good intent? That wasn't their intent. Something else was their intent, and it ended up that someone, got their head hit. And these are the kinds of things we're constantly worried about because the presumption is that they already agree on all the principles. We all already agree that murder and rape and hitting and beating and so forth is wrong, right? Where things become different is when we are involved in political disagreements, where you have different socio-political movements, where by definition, they have different suites of principles that they're founded upon, or not necessarily founded upon, it could be post hoc. They come to have different justifications for their principles over time, and they evolve, these sorts of things. They are different socio-political movements because they differ in the principles that they hold. Within any one of those, people could be having infighting and say, look, Doug, if you're going to be a good member of our community, then why did you do this? And he might say, well, I was well-intentioned. I thought that would fit our principles, and they'll argue, but it's really about whether, was I conforming to the principles, or it was an honest mistake? I thought that was a principle. You can argue those, but you can't make those arguments to folks that are in other socio-political movements. That misses the point. They are in different socio-political movements because they believe that good intent is to do different kinds of stuff than you do. Right? So, my generation grew up constantly fighting socialism and communism, constantly, all the time. The good and the right, especially for young college kids, was, oh yeah, you should be a socialist. You should totally feel like, everybody's money is everybody else's, and all of these sorts of good feelings. These people had good intentions, and the socialists still do, almost to a man and a woman. They do. They have different sets of principles than do I. I cannot argue with them and say, oh, you don't have good intent. No, they do. They have good intent about the wrong sorts of things. They have bad principles. It's because of their bad principles which makes, in my opinion, their actions evil, right? They're involved in no good, but it's not because they're not well-intentioned. And I think you should deem this obvious, because in regular everyday life, the only reason that you think that well-intentionedness matters is because you know in their heart they already agree with you that rape and murder and hitting on heads is wrong. And you also know that for sociopolitical movements, that you have a fundamental disagreement with the other movement about what is wrong or right in the first place. Right? That's why well-intentionedness is not a predictor of evil at all at those levels. But I think people still want to come back to the way they think in normal life, imagining that everybody shares the same principles as do you. This is kind of a cultural provincialism, thinking that if you go to a different culture and they do weird stuff, you say, well, they're just so weird. No, they just have different kinds of cultural stuff they do. You can't say that they're trying to do something weird. No, that's just the stuff that they do. And the same sorts of things happen for principles for those that are in opposing sociopolitical movements. You can't say that they're bad intentioned when they just have different principles that they believe are good. Again, this is not defending them. This is just trying to lay out the mathematics, in some sense, of what it is. If you want to understand why they do what they do, you have to understand that they've come to have, post hoc often, principles that justify the things that you believe are evil. So if you want to fight them, argue with them and so forth, you have to admit, yeah, I get it that you're well-intentioned, but your principles are wrong. It's not going to do you any good to say, no, you're bad intentioned. You believe in all the principles. You understand that all the principles from my community are right, and you're purposely trying to violate them. And what does that make them? It makes them a demon, right? It makes them a witch. That's what witches and demons are. They're people that understand the good, and it's what you think the good is, and they purposely try to subvert it. And that's not what is happening at all. And if you take that tact with them, you're going to look like a fool, because they're not bad intentioned in their own lights. Of course they're not, right? And again, that is no defense. Right? All right, and that was your science moment. If you haven't got a copy of Dr. Tim Barber and my book, Expressly Human, on the origins of emotional expressions in humans and all social animals, get yourself a copy today from Amazon. And that was your science moment.